I'll run through a statement I prepared about the report's findings, and then we'll have time at the end certainly to take questions, do interviews, whatever you need. So thank you for joining today. My name is David Mazur. I'm the Executive Director for the PennEnvironment Research and Policy Center, which is a statewide nonprofit environmental organization working to promote clean air, clean water, and protecting Pennsylvania's great natural heritage. Today, the PennEnvironment Research and Policy Center is releasing our newest study entitled Lead in School Drinking Water: How Pennsylvania School Districts and the Commonwealth Are Failing to Protect Children's Health. For the past 2 weeks, kids all across the Commonwealth have been returning to school to start the new school year. And we expect that our schools should be safe places where our kids go to learn, achieve, build lifelong friendships, and grow up to be productive citizens in society. School buildings are also the place where our kids spend much, if not most, of their waking hours. Yet far too often, kids in our schools face the threat of lead in drinking water. Our study shows how Pennsylvania school districts regularly put children at risk of becoming exposed to lead, a well-documented contaminant, in school drinking water by violating state law, skirting reporting requirements, and avoiding best practices to tackle lead contamination. Our study uncovered shortcomings right here in the Harrisburg School District as well as the York School District in the region. Unfortunately, there's ample data showing that the threat of lead in school drinking water is a problem here in the Commonwealth. A recent study found that over 90% of Pennsylvania school districts had drinking water tests positive when they tested for lead contamination in their school buildings. That should be unacceptable. The medical research is crystal clear. There is no safe level of lead, especially for children. It leads to learning disabilities, hearing and speech problems. It affects brain development and lowers IQ. Sadly, for Pennsylvania parents, teachers, students, and community members, getting information to know if your local school district is implementing the best practices to address the threat of lead in school drinking water can be a near impossible task. Data is often withheld or not posted on district websites, and school districts regularly put up roadblocks to avoid answering basic questions about the scope of the threat or their plans to deal with it. And with few state or federal laws to ensure that school districts are taking the proper steps to protect children from lead in school drinking water, communities have few paths for recourse. Given that, the PennEnvironment Research and Policy Center submitted a series of right-to-know requests to 9 of Pennsylvania's largest school districts across the state. Yet our findings show that when it comes to lead in drinking water, school districts are failing in their responsibility to protect children in a number of ways. This includes, number 1, hindering access to lead testing results. 2, failing to test school drinking fountains for potential lead contamination as required under Pennsylvania law. 3rd, failing to test an adequate number of drinking outlets to detect potential lead contamination. 4th, failing to provide positive test results to the Pennsylvania Department of Education as required by state law. 5th, using loopholes in Pennsylvania's existing requirements to avoid testing and reporting of lead altogether. And lastly, failing to provide sufficient access to drinking water as required under Pennsylvania state law. All of the districts for which we filed right-to-know requests violated best practices for addressing the threat of lead in school drinking water and even comprehensively testing for lead. And an astounding 8 of the 9 school districts we surveyed were actually in violation of existing laws around testing for lead and access to drinking water. For local school districts, we uncovered the following. In Harrisburg, the school district appeared to test for lead in some drinking water, but did not share the results with the Pennsylvania Department of Education to be publicly posted. This is critical since the lead in drinking water testing results were not published by the Harrisburg School District. The school district also was unable to confirm that it was meeting the statewide requirement of 1 working drinking fountain for every 100 occupants of its school buildings. Down the road in York, we found multiple violations of state requirements and best practices, including not testing for lead in school drinking water each year as required by state law, testing for lead but not sharing the results with the Department of Education as required under the state law, too few outlets tested to be able to properly ferret out lead in drinking water, and results not publicly posted by the school district. We found similar results at the other 7 large school districts we surveyed across Pennsylvania. To be crystal clear, our study shows that the test and fix strategy is a flawed strategy. We must move straight to replacing fountains with water stations that have filters to remove lead. Every Pennsylvania parent should know and be able to expect that their school district is protecting their kids from the threat of lead in drinking water. Of course, we hope that all of the school districts whose data we reviewed will see this as a stark wake-up call and be motivated to immediately implement the best practices for protecting school kids from the threat of lead in school drinking water. This is known as the filter-first solution, which involves removing all old, antiquated drinking fountains from every school building in the district and replacing them with lead filtering, water bottle filling stations, and drinking fountains. But if we're truly going to solve the threat of lead in school drinking water in every school building across all of Pennsylvania's 500 school districts, the PennEnvironment Research and Policy Center is calling on the General Assembly to immediately implement a pending bipartisan proposal, which is Senate Bill 986 and House Bill 2011, which would require all Pennsylvania school districts to implement the Filter First program and replace drinking fountains that pose a risk of lead contamination with lead filtering, water bottle filling stations, and drinking fountains. The legislation also includes funding to help Pennsylvania school districts cover the cost of these much-needed upgrades to protect kids' health. Given that lead in school drinking water is a pervasive problem, it's critical that districts move away from testing for the problem and start implementing the comprehensive filter-first solution. Some of Pennsylvania's largest school districts understand the pervasive threat posed by lead in school drinking water and are leading by example. This includes the Pittsburgh Public Schools, the state's 2nd largest school district, which recently completed replacing every single drinking fountain across the district with lead filtering, water bottle filling stations, and drinking fountains. It also includes the School District of Philadelphia, which is required under a citywide law to replace all of its old drinking fountains with lead filtering outlets by the end of this calendar year. And the school districts in Erie, Pennsylvania, which recently passed an ordinance requiring the school district to replace all of its antiquated drinking fountains as well. It's critical that the school districts uncovered in our report and all Pennsylvania school districts follow Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Erie's lead to properly protect school children from the threat of lead in water. These are the gold standard in Pennsylvania when working to address the threat of lead in school drinking water. But if school districts won't voluntarily implement the widely accepted best practices for protecting our children from the threat of lead in drinking water, then it's urgent that our elected officials here in Harrisburg move swiftly to implement a statewide solution to this well-documented problem. It's time to get the lead out and pass Senate Bill 986 and House Bill 2011, which will ensure safe drinking water for our children. Thank you for coming, and at this time I can open it up for questions from the media. Thank you.
David, why these 9 districts?
We picked these 9 districts on a couple of different factors. We looked at a geographic range around the Commonwealth. We looked at larger districts where more students could be at risk, and wanted to look at data. We had some data, as I mentioned, for Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Erie, 3 other large school districts, but since they've been fairly transparent in solving the problem, there wasn't a need to make requests from those large districts. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of the financial cost of doing universal lead filtering versus testing system?
Yeah, so the question is the cost. To be fully transparent, it's a little complicated because school districts aren't transparent in what they've done so far, and that shows in our right to know request. When we ask school districts, how many drinking fountains do you have? How many have you replaced with lead filtering equipment? The vast majority of the school districts with which we filed right to know requests said they didn't know, which is shocking. But our estimate is it would and Senate Bill 986 and House Bill 2011 have this. They have $30 million included to cover the costs, and we think that's probably a pretty close estimate based on what we've seen from school districts around the state that have started the work to complete it across Pennsylvania. And $30 million, obviously for folks who work in this building, is a fairly small price tag to protect all of Pennsylvania's school kids in all of our schools from lead. I would add that because the replacements are fairly inexpensive, our estimate is approximately $2,500 to put in a lead filtering drinking fountain or hydration station, and that includes labor. A study out of Michigan actually showed over time it's much more expensive to test properly, get those tests sent to a lab and get the results back, and because you'll find lead so regularly, then you'll have to replace the equipment. So the study out of Michigan showed that over a 10-year period, Michigan school districts would save $300 million of taxpayer money in averted costs from testing if they just stopped testing today and went to replacing the equipment. And I'll add, in that case, Michigan passed the law similar to Pennsylvania's to do just that. So this is a very, we think, financially sound fix as well.
Can you clarify what are they supposed to be doing under the law and sort of how are they falling short?
Sure. In 2018, Pennsylvania passed Act 29, which basically requires them to do a bare minimum of testing for lead. Unfortunately, it has a set of loopholes and exemptions that make it easy for districts to do an end run around even the reporting requirements. So they can hold a school board meeting and talk about the issue of lead, and then they no longer have to test for lead. And we found some districts were confused about if they find lead at different levels, should they test it or should they report it to the Department of Education or not. But I think this shows that the testing and fix really doesn't work. And in some of our research, as I mentioned, districts were testing but not sharing the data. And Bethlehem, which is one of the districts in our report, in 2017, before the passage of the state law, they came out and said, we did testing and look, we found no lead. Ta-da, the problem is solved. Once they were required to start testing again under the state law, they actually had a school district, a drinking outlet, come back at 247 parts per billion for lead, which is 247 times above what the health community would say is safe. And I think that exemplifies that because the testing is so erratic, often not done correctly, and because it's a moving contaminant and can change over time, it can be very misleading to test, particularly if not done correct. I would also add, John, that a lot of districts, because the law doesn't require a certain amount of outlets to be tested, they'll only test maybe one or two. So we found school district would test one sink in a nurse's office, but they wouldn't test any of the drinking fountains. And that's not a best practice even for testing. You have to test all the outlets every year, given there's lead from the service line all the way to the drinking fountains themselves can be found in the equipment. Rachel.
Just to clarify, so there are best practices for testing, but are you saying that you should really just move beyond testing, just replace everything to be sure?
Yes, yes. The takeaway here is school districts should stop testing for lead and they should start remediating the problem. We know that when they test, they will find lead. It's pervasive in districts all across the Commonwealth. Data out of Philadelphia before the city passed the required ordinance showed 98% of school buildings in Philadelphia tested positive for lead in their drinking water. That's an astounding number, and we see similar numbers across the state. So districts that think testing will fix this problem are wrong-headed.
Lead's big. We know that Pennsylvania, many school buildings are old in general on many things. They also are dealing with mold. There's other issues. Is there a way to pull in fixing some of the other concerns with the lead replacements? Or is this, we just need to focus on lead and then we'll focus on other things?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly there are a whole variety of environmental health issues facing our school buildings. And I think the legislature, to its credit, understood that and passed a significant increase in funding in the past budget to go towards environmental health issues that could be lead in drinking water, lead paint, asbestos, mold, other challenges. This fix is pretty straightforward by just taking out the drinking fountain and replacing it. So you probably, I think your question is, could you get a twofer? Like if you did this, could you get something else? I think the problem is we certainly know that when left to their own devices, districts often won't tap into, excuse my bad pun there maybe, but existing money sources to fix this problem, because there has been money for many years, ESSER funds from the federal government, water infrastructure grants through EPA, and we mostly find that school districts still aren't incentivized to tap into those funds, and that's why setting the requirement that they must replace this equipment is key. And I think to the sponsors' credit of the state legislation, including funds in their proposal. But certainly school districts could use the money that was passed in the recent budget to do this. I think we're just a little nervous that they have so many other priorities, asbestos, lead, and mold, that they likely will direct it to other things. And this problem will not get comprehensively solved. Yeah.
Have you heard anything from the Department of Education as far as enforcement? It sounds like the districts either aren't doing the testing properly or they're not reporting it to the department properly. What is the control mechanism there? It sounds like maybe isn't much of one.
I think that's certainly one of the challenges. When through our right to know requests, we were finding districts that were sharing test results for lead with us, but that weren't showing up on PDE's website. We shared that with the department to flag it for them that there are some, problems in reporting and enforcement. I tend to think it's probably just the tip of the iceberg, and it's one more reason why testing won't be a solution. And we have to move away from it, because I think there's so many loopholes and so many places school districts purposely or not do it incorrectly. It will make it hard to solve the problem if we just don't buckle down and replace the equipment and the outlets in the schools.
Did you hear back from any of these school districts after the right to know process? Like, did you say, like, you're, by the law, you're in violation of these, and did you get any response back from them?
We had mixed responses. I should add to Rachel's question. At the start of this process, we volunteered and offered to school districts if they would like to avoid the right to know process and just work with us informally to look at the data and try and figure out what's happening under the hood in their district. We, of course, want them to do the right thing and help them solve those problems. All of these districts turned down our offer to do that. And many of them, when we went back and tried to get, had questions to clarify some of the information, mostly stonewalled us and wouldn't try and clarify information. So in Harrisburg, they noted that they had purchased lead filtering hydration stations. When we went back and said, oh, that's great, so are they all actually put into the schools, and where are they? We wouldn't get an answer. So we, again, I think this is part of the challenge in testing and just access to information. If we just replace the question, we won't have these hurdles put up by school districts. We'll just know that the best practice is in place. But I think anyone who's ever filed a right to know request with the school districts know it's a slog, and they want to make it as hard and painful as possible. And it's hard enough for us. You can imagine how hard it is for a parent or a teacher who wants access to information to make sure their kids are safe.
And then do you have the results for Harrisburg that came up in the right to know but were not posted on PDE's website?
Yes, I'll email the electronic copy of the press release, which has the full report. It also has a link to the Harrisburg right to know request that we filed. And in the report, we'd lay out through a chart all of the places that Harrisburg and York were not meeting the criteria or violating best practices, or, as I mentioned, in some cases, existing state law. Yeah.
So violating state law, is there a penalty to them for that, whether it's a fine or anything like that, or is it just kind of rushed under the rug?
Yeah, I sadly, I think there aren't very many repercussions, and it's probably part of the reason you see violations occur. I think there certainly are school districts that are trying their hardest, but just aren't up to speed on what some of the requirements are. We had a conversation with a facilities staff person in northeastern Pennsylvania who, when we said that there's a requirement that they have a drinking fountain for every 100 occupants, his response was, oh, I thought it was for every 200 occupants. And, I took on that phone call that I thought it was a mistake, but he seemed sincere that it was an honest mistake. But again, I think all these things come back to there are so many places where this can go south and districts can make mistakes. We know that if they do replace the equipment, so like in Philadelphia, the school district of Philadelphia, where they put in hundreds and hundreds of these, they go back and test some of those outlets, and they're finding 0 to negligible levels of lead. So we know this solution works, and why we're calling on them to, avoid this sort of bureaucratic nightmare and all the flaws that come with the testing regimen. Yeah. Thanks, Ireland.
Just one question about the money in the state bills, the $30 million. Do you know if that would come from the federal government? Because there is some federal funding going to flood pipes. Where would this money come from?
Yeah, the state bill, the question is, where's the funding come from? The state bill would be state funds. There is some federal money, but again, it's not specifically allocated just towards replacing the equipment. So you may have seen that a few weeks back, the federal government actually gave the state just shy of $1 million, but that could go towards testing, it could go towards replacement. And again, the problem is if the state agencies give it to districts to just use it for testing, we're now throwing good money after bad. and not going to solve the problem. Yeah. Other questions? Great. Well, if you have other questions, certainly I'll be here. Thank you all for coming. And as I said, I'll send over an electronic version of all the materials.